Trigger warning. This story contains descriptions of violent assault and crimes involving a newborn. If you are sensitive to these topics, please consider pausing now. The 911 call started like so many others, breathless, compressed into sentences that stumbled over themselves as the caller tried to give the dispatcher a place, a name, and a state. "There's a woman. She's hurt. She's pregnant. Someone took the baby. I don't know what happened." In the background, the sound of shoes slapping concrete, a neighbor's voice calling for an ambulance, a child's cry cut short. Within minutes, city radios lit up, and a code was dispatched: severe trauma, possible fetal injury. A surgical team was alerted on the way. Emergency rooms are used to chaos. They are not used to the kind of violence that leaves a city searching for a word to name it. This was one of those evenings where the ordinary, rush hour traffic, an elevator bearing down on a hotel corridor, a clerk locking a back door, met an act so violent and bewildering that every routine broke. Paramedics carried a young woman into trauma. Hospital staff would later find a small bundle of baby clothes at the scene, carefully folded, the fabric clean enough to seem staged. It was a clue that felt like a taunt. What followed was a scramble that would occupy detectives, forensic technicians, hospital administrators, and a community that watched the news feeds and whispered to each other on stoops. For many, the simplest question was the loudest. How could someone walk up carrying a handful of tiny garments and leave a life altered forever? Her name, when it became public in the days that followed, was Ivy Morris. She was 27, a lifelong resident of the neighborhood, and every woman with bills and plans and small acts of decency threaded through daily life. Those who knew her used words like steady, kind, generous. They told stories that seemed to exist to make the loss harder to reduce to headlines. How she'd given her lunch to a coworker who forgot theirs, how she'd sat with a neighbor through a long night of coughing, how she saved tips from the hotel's valet stand so she could one day buy a second-hand crib. Ivy's life had routine rhythms. She worked the afternoon and evening shift at the Grand Meridian, a hotel whose marble lobby and doorman uniforms made it easy for visitors to imagine an affluent district inside a city that was far more conflicted than its glossy surface suggested. On weekday mornings, she would wake early, make a pot of tea, and phone her sister for a quick rundown of errands. She and Derek, her partner, had been talking about baby names in clipped, nervous ways over late-night Chinese delivery. Derek worked construction. His hands were calloused, his laugh easy in the moments before exhaustion set in. They argued occasionally about rent, about whether to accept a loan from Derek's parents, about whether Ivy should take the night job she'd been offered closer to home. Mostly, they planned a small, careful future. At the hotel, Ivy's supervisor, Grace, said she always arrived with a tidy smile and a readiness to help guests and coworkers. She was the kind of employee who noticed when an elderly guest's bag was heavy, who would walk a visitor to a taxi. Another friend, Rachel, worked the front desk. She remembered Ivy singing under her breath while restocking the minibar and bringing stale donuts to the staff room for those who'd missed breakfast. These small, domestic details would later be parsed by television anchors for the way they highlighted the cruelty of what happened. A woman known to hand over her own warmth, made to pay such an unimaginable price. The object that threaded its way through every account of the night was humble, a bundle of baby clothes. It was discovered discarded near the loading dock, an item bagged by uniformed officers, logged into evidence. To anyone who had ever folded tiny garments in preparation for a first child, the sight of soft cotton and printed ducks was intimate, even tender. To the detectives, it was a calculated element. Whoever left that bundle either wanted to be found, wanted to mislead, or both. The woman accused of leaving that bundle had a public face that fit easily into neighborhoods and charity events. Her name, as detectives would later record in arrest reports, was Marion Hale. To acquaintances, she was courteous, the sort of person who volunteered at a community center and made well-meaning comments at fundraisers. She smiled in photographs holding newborns at charity drives. She lent coats to people in the winter months. That public persona is part of what made the allegations against her so confounding. When someone who seems to live by small acts of giving becomes the axis of suspicion in a crime that centers on a newborn, it forces every witness to examine how well they can really know another person. But evidence does not care for personas. It cares for timestamps and fibers and the geometry of footprints. The early hours of the investigation were devoted to converting the chaos of the emergency into searchable facts. Crime scene technicians mapped the alleyways and loading docks behind the hotel. They took photographs of the little pile of clothes and logged the precise coordinates where a courier surveillance camera had caught a figure in a hooded jacket crossing a service entrance.
Statements were taken from coworkers who had last seen Ivy alive. Derek, pale and confused, sat quietly in the station for hours as officers wrote down everything he could remember, from the time he'd left for a third-shift job the week before to the note Ivy had left about lunch plans. Medical teams at the hospital had a different set of tasks. Ivy arrived in shock. The trauma surgeons moved with rehearsed motion. They did everything within their protocols to stabilize her.
In the emergency department, clinicians initiated procedures aimed at saving both mother and fetus. I am not a medical professional. I must flag that specific clinical details about the nature of the injuries and the precise interventions performed are indefinito, without access to hospital records or professional medical consultation. What can be reported accurately is this. Ivy was taken to an operating room for emergency surgery. Care teams worked to address severe abdominal trauma. By the time she was in the post-operative unit, the question of the infant's whereabouts had become central to the criminal investigation. News of the attack traveled faster than the official updates. A local news outlet's morning crawl mistakenly used a photo of a baby shower from a charity event in which Marion had posed, and within hours, social feeds began circulating opinions and accusations. The hospital released a narrowly worded statement. A patient had been admitted with severe injuries consistent with assault. Law enforcement was involved. Patient privacy would be respected. Police issued an appeal for witnesses and for anyone whose dashcam or surveillance camera had captured activity near the hotel between approximately 6 and 8 p.m. that evening. The plea was methodical. Names, times, the items of interest, including the small bundle of baby clothes recovered at the scene. Detectives scoured footage from nearby storefronts. One camera, with a grainy angle that included the hotel's service entrance, captured a woman moving briskly across a loading area at 7:14 p.m., carrying what appeared to be a bundle. The image was not proof of anything by itself. Camera frames can lie, shadows can create shapes that look like arms or packages. Still, it was the first hard lead. Detectives circulated a still and asked neighbors and employees if anyone recognized the person seen in the frame. That evening, a supervisor at the hotel told investigators that Ivy had left the building to run a quick errand during her break. She had been seen talking, briefly, to an older woman in a beige coat near the west entrance. The woman, according to the supervisor, had been carrying a small plastic bag and had spoken in what the coworker described as a soft and urgent tone. She sounded worried, the supervisor said on the record, like she needed help. The description fit no one's sketch of a criminal actor. It fit the story of a person performing small kindnesses on the street, pressing a button on someone's elevator, offering tissues, asking directions with innocent urgency. In interviews, Ivy's friends replayed the scene over and over the way people replay a song after a sudden silence. They emphasized that Ivy had an instinct to help. She had been the kind of person who, when confronted by a stranger with a problem, especially a pregnant-looking woman, might step forward without a plan, without scanning for risk.
That instinct is neither uncommon nor culpable. It is, tragically, one of the interactions manipulative actors exploit. Investigators quickly began to build two parallel narratives, one from the crime scene and one from digital traces. The physical narrative included the folded baby clothes and traces of fabric fibers that forensic technicians bagged and sent to the lab. The digital narrative began with an initial sweep of cell phone metadata. Inquiries were made to major carriers for devices that had been pinging the cell towers surrounding the hotel at the relevant times. Investigators obtained a court order to get a warrant for any device that had been identified as a potential match near the loading dock. Early search queries turned up an account associated with a woman named Marion Hale that, in the week before the assault, had posts about volunteer work at mother and infant support groups and photographs of donated baby items neatly arranged for distribution. The distinction between what was confirmed versus what was being assumed mattered in every conversation. Police were careful in early press briefings to label as alleged anything tying Marion to the act. Prosecutors later would remind the press that an arrest is not a conviction and that court proceedings must decide criminal responsibility. But in informal conversations, in the quiet hospitals of the city, neighbors speculated in ways that blurred those boundaries. People asked whether a woman capable of public acts of kindness could also have a secret life that included possession of another's newborn. Motives were immediately parsed, often by people who had no access to evidentiary files. Hypotheses ranged widely. Could this be a case of child trafficking, where stolen infants are sold to buyers who desire very young children? Could it be an instance of pathological envy or a psychiatric condition that drives someone to take a child by force? Could it be a crime tied to a broader network targeting pregnant women? Detectives listed these potential motives as hypotheses, clearly labeled as such, pending corroboration. At the scene, no cash exchanges were found, and no vehicles matching common trafficking profiles were observed in the immediate camera sweep. That did not rule anything out. It simply meant the evidence remained incomplete. As the sun rose over the neighborhood the next morning, a different kind of work began.
Forensic units examined the baby clothes for trace evidence, hair, fibers, even microscopic particles that could link the fabric to a location or person. Technicians swabbed the seams for DNA and sent samples to a state laboratory. Detectives pored over hours of footage, frame by frame, seeking the exact moment when the figure carrying the bundle crossed the hotel's threshold, and whether the same figure appeared on other cameras earlier or later in the evening.
At the police precinct, lead detective Marcus Reed sat with a table full of such small items that together made the remnant of a huge event. Reed had been on the force for 15 years. He'd worked homicide and major crimes. He spoke slowly, in an even voice that betrayed little. "We're trying to construct a timeline as narrowly as possible," he said. "Who was where, between what minutes? Every minute is a place where we can corroborate or exclude an account." Reed and his team interviewed Derek for the second time, and the recollections tightened into a more coherent picture. Derek remembered Ivy heading out after filling a small thermos. He remembered the temperature dropping and thinking he should have suggested she take her coat. He said he received a text from Ivy at 6:58 p.m. that read simply, "Be right back." At 7:46 p.m., he received a phone call from his neighbor screaming. Derek did the only thing a partner in panic can do. He ran. In the station interview, his hands trembled when he showed detectives the last photo he had of Ivy on his phone. She was laughing at a joke, hand mid-gesture, hair pinned back, an expectant look in her face that made detectives look away for a moment. Back at the hospital, child welfare and social work units prepared for the possibility that the infant, if found, would need immediate placement or protective custody. They coordinated with pediatric teams and the police to plan for the child's rights in the event of recovery, another item for the long list of legal and medical paperwork that would define the rest of the case. In parallel, the district attorney's office opened a file and assigned a chief trial counsel to monitor the investigation. The DA's office emphasized that any charges would be weighed carefully against the evidence and the need to ensure the safety of the public and the rights of all involved. Public reaction split along predictable lines. On one side, neighbors and strangers held vigils outside the hospital, setting small arrangements of flowers and stuffed animals near a chalkboard that read, in black letters, "Prayers for Ivy." On the other, social media became a theater where facts were stretched or snipped to suit narratives. Amateur sleuths posted time-lapse reconstructions of camera footage, overlaying their own annotations. Some accounts urged calm and patience, posting the official police number for tips. Others leaked rumors and misidentified parishioners, bus drivers, and volunteers as persons of interest. The police repeatedly asked the public not to take matters into their own hands, or to engage in harassment. They requested that anyone with footage submit it through the official tip line. There were moments of human tenderness amid the procedural grind. A supervisor at Ivy's hotel arranged for staff to take turns visiting the hospital. Grace knelt in the chapel with her hands clasped, murmuring for Ivy's recovery.
Rachel, when she learned about the baby clothes found near the scene, went through the small pile of crocheted booties she had saved from a friend's child and thought of the surreal way objects can shift meaning, from celebration to evidence, from cradle to clue. Marion Hale's image became a polite shadow in the background of these personal stories. People who had crossed paths with her offered conflicting accounts. A neighbor who received a warm meal from Marion during a cold snap, a mother who remembered being thanked by Marion at a charity brunch, a volunteer coordinator who described Marion as punctual and generous. Then a woman at a grocery store, who had no connection to the suspect, came forward to say she remembered seeing Marion near the service entrance of the hotel on the night in question, carrying a brown paper bag with diapers printed on the side. That observation, when matched against the blurry camera image, nudged investigators toward a certain hypothesis, but it was still only one detail in a developing mosaic. As the lab results began to arrive, the case gained its first tentative forensics. A fiber analysis returned indicating that fibers on the baby clothes matched those commonly used in donated clothing from a particular textile batch distributed by a local charity. The connection was circumstantial but intriguing. Marion had volunteered at several such drives. DNA testing of trace material on the tag would take longer. Detectives knew, as all serious investigators learn, that timing is critical. An early misstep in public statements can compromise an entire investigation, so they proceeded with care, releasing only the facts they could confirm and marking everything else as investigation in progress. There was one lead that solidified focus, a CCTV clip from a convenience store 2 blocks from the hotel. It showed a woman who, in posture and gait, resembled the person in the loading dock footage. She appeared at 6:59 p.m., purchasing a small pack of baby wipes, then walking east toward the hotel. The woman in the convenience clip wore a beige coat and carried a small tote. Detectives circulated the clip internally, and an analyst compared frame-by-frame movements, how the suspect swung her arms, the angle of her head, to the loading dock footage. The analyst's language was cautious. The two figures bear a close resemblance, but absolute identification would require corroborating evidence.
It was at this point that the investigation began to widen into other institutions. The investigators queried hospital visitor logs and rideshare data for vehicles that had picked up or dropped off near the hotel that night. They subpoenaed phone records for devices that had been in the vicinity. They checked payment records at nearby ATMs in case someone had made an out-of-character purchase. They called banks, car rental agencies, and shelters to see if any transactions matched the movement pattern shown on cameras.
Meanwhile, the press briefings began to mention Marion by name, careful to note that she was a person of interest or individual whom investigators wished to speak to. The phrase person of interest is slippery in public discourse. It can sound like guilt to many ears. That slippage would become a matter of discussion later, as media ethics and the need for accuracy collided with public appetite for certainty. For Ivy's family, the period was a traumatic blur that combined waiting with partial knowledge. They sat in hospital hallways, held by friends and by strangers who thought to bring warm clothes and casseroles. Derek, who had never been the center of a police inquiry before, found himself both comforted and alarmed by the attention. He spoke in interviews with a quiet voice, sometimes losing track of what he had said before. "I just want answers," he told a reporter. "I want to know who did this and why. I want our child back, if that's possible." He was careful, as advised by detectives, not to speak about anything that might be used in court, but the public presence of grief is rarely so controlled. By the end of the first week, a warrant was authorized for Marion Hale's apartment. Forensic officers prepared to execute it. Neighbors were notified, and rumors thickened like storm clouds. Marion's past volunteer affiliations were photographed by tabloids and recycled across websites that trafficked in speculation. The department's press office cautioned the public to limit commentary until evidence was fully compiled. Detective Reed briefed his team before the warrant execution. They reviewed probable cause, the surveillance matches, witness statements, the fiber link to donated clothing, and cell phone pings placing a device associated with Marion near the hotel within minutes of the incident. None of these alone would suffice to secure a conviction. Together, they formed a legal threshold that a judge had to accept for the search. The team made clear that the execution needed to be precise and contained, no unnecessary spectacle, no leaks, and above all, preservation of any evidence that could be used later in court. In the hours before officers moved in, a small group of volunteers gathered outside the hospital to sing quietly. Staff inside checked their phones compulsively for updates from the squad room. A nurse, Lena Ortiz, who had examined Ivy during triage, sat with a cup of coffee and thought about the thin line between caring for patients and bearing witness to crimes. "We see wounds," she said, "but we're also witnesses to people's lives. It's not just a physical thing, it's everything that comes after." When the tactical team arrived at Marion's door, the neighborhood seemed suspended, as if waiting for a bell to toll. A woman who weeks earlier had stood at donation drives accepting tiny garments would have her privacy invaded by legal process, and perhaps, if the evidence supported it, would face accountability. The investigators moved with the gravity such moments deserve, knowing that the work either would help restore a family's fragments or would expose the fragility of assumptions the community had been making. Inside the apartment, crews began cataloging items, boxes of donated clothing, a binder filled with volunteer sign-in sheets, receipts for charitable purchases, a notebook with names and addresses scribbled in a steady hand. Officers found a small laundry tag that matched the brand on the baby garments recovered at the scene. A bag of wipes, similar to those purchased at the convenience store, lay unpaid in a kitchen trash can. Phone records revealed a device registered to Marion that pinged near the hotel at 7:04 p.m. She was not at home when officers knocked, but returned later that morning accompanied by an attorney. When Marion arrived at the station to speak with detectives, she was calm, measured, and polite. She denied any involvement in the attack and handed over a statement in which she explained her volunteer activities and insisted she had been at home that evening caring for an elderly aunt. Her alibi, as detectives soon learned, had some corroboration: neighbors who saw her at the window and an online video conference timestamp that showed her seated near the time in question. But witnesses are imperfect. Alibis can be incomplete. Detectives continued to press, continuing their careful balancing act between seeking truth and preserving procedural integrity. In the precinct, even as the forensic lab worked through swabs and as lawyers argued the admissibility of certain pieces of evidence, a more human narrative threaded through. The city felt violated in some ineffable way. People who walked their children to school tightened their grips on strollers. A mother who had once taken a stranger's hand to cross a busy street scowled now when anyone made an overly warm approach. the case would prompt debates about trust and suspicion, about how to reconcile public acts of kindness with the possibility of private harm. Those debates would be messy and imperfect, sparked by legitimate fear, but fueled, sometimes, by misinformation. The investigation moved forward on two tracks: the evidentiary accumulation and the human testimony. Each relied upon the other. Statements could direct technicians to look at a particular camera. A chemical detection could focus interviews on a location people had overlooked. Detectives briefed the district attorney's office whenever a new strand suggested a criminal charge might be supported. In conference rooms lit by fluorescent bulbs, prosecutors and officers argued over language, over the exact charges that would most fairly and effectively reflect the alleged conduct. Kidnapping? Aggravated assault? Child endangerment? Each term had legal contours. Each required evidence in specific forms. The DA's office advised restraint. They insisted on precise, careful filings.
And yet, even as the legal machinery turned, pieces of the family's life continued to drift. Flowers piled up against the hospital wall, and a city councilor called a meeting to discuss public safety for expected mothers. The hotel instituted new policy. Staff would no longer be allowed to step outside for breaks alone at certain hours without notifying a supervisor. Small changes, they hoped, would prevent another family's life from tipping into the same abyss. For now, the most immediate question pulsing through the city remained: where was the infant? Detectives kept that question at the center of every decision. If the child had been taken, locating and protecting that newborn became not just the primary investigative objective, but a moral imperative. If the child had perished, the work would shift toward accountability and the traumatic aftermath. Hospitals across the region were put on alert to report any infants brought in without proper documentation. Child welfare agencies were notified to watch for adoptions or inquiries that deviated from standard procedures. Clerks at shelters and registrars were asked to be particularly vigilant. In the late afternoon, a young analyst at the city's crime lab sent an alert that a match in the database had flagged a potential connection. The DNA swab from the baby clothes had produced a partial profile consistent with a close female relative to a person already in the state database for a nonviolent offense. The alert was preliminary, the kind of result that demanded verification. Detective Reed read the notification twice and then asked for a second confirmatory test. For him, the comforting thing about the lab result was not that it offered immediate closure, but that it offered direction, a place to look harder, to connect dots that had been outlines. It is worth noting that the scientific processes investigators used are exacting and time-consuming, and they do not produce immediate narrative satisfaction. DNA matches can be partial. Database hits can return familial associations that require follow-up investigation. A partial match increases the probability that a suspect's relative is connected, but it does not itself convict anyone. The team treated this lead with the same cautious language they had used from the start, a promising lead, but by no means conclusive. As night closed in again over the city, the investigation had firmed enough to justify questioning Marion further. She sat across from Detective Reed in an interrogation room whose walls had seen too many broken stories. The recording device hummed unobtrusively above them. Marion answered questions in a calm voice, alternately explaining small errands she'd run earlier in the week and her involvement with a charity distributing baby clothes downtown. She denied being near the hotel the evening in question. She described never having met Ivy. She asked to speak with an attorney.
Reed kept the conversation focused and procedural. He did not sketch hypothetical scenarios or speculate about motives. He read her the limited warrant that had been signed. He told her the lab had found fibers consistent with donated garments associated with her volunteer work, and that a device registered to her had pinged near the hotel. He watched her face for changes that could suggest deception. Marion maintained her composure. Whatever inner state she held, she did not collapse into sobs or rages. She spoke in measured sentences about standing trial if the evidence demanded it. She assured authorities that she respected the law. Towards the last quarter of the interview, Reed shifted tactics and asked about a photograph, a momentary human sound in the statute-choked room. He asked Marion to recount where she had been at 7 p.m. the night of the assault. Marion repeated her alibi. She had been at home, she had helped an elderly neighbor, she had gone to bed early. Reed asked one more question, simple, ordinary, human. Had she ever felt so desperate for a child that she might take one? Marion's eyes narrowed for the briefest of moments. She answered no. When the interview concluded, Marion left the station with the same calm outwardness with which she had entered, flanked by an attorney who declined to comment. Outside, the press crowded.
and someone shouted a question about the baby. Marion's face did not change. She stepped into a car and drove away. Detectives returned to the precinct and to evidence that made the story less abstract. A receipt from the convenience store matched the wipe spot minutes before the CCTV image of the woman walking toward the hotel. A timeline coalesced: the convenience store purchase, the coffeehouse CCTV blur, the hotel loading dock footage, and the small pile of baby clothes left where a courier might have seen them. They had a partial DNA match, and a phone ping, and an inconsistent alibi. They had motive in the form of hypotheses, but no confession, no recovered infant, and no incontrovertible proof. That is where the first major chapter of the case paused, on a juncture of accumulating evidence and persistent unknowns. The city's appetite for certainty was robust, its supply of it limited. In the days ahead, the narrative would expand to include more forensic detail, courtroom strategy, and community reaction. For now, there was a family waiting, a suspect insisting on innocence, an evidence locker half full of small telling objects, and a bundle of baby clothes folded in a chain of custody, their soft fabric a mute testimony to a night that none of the participants would forget. If this episode is difficult for you, please consider pausing and seeking support. If you want to follow updates on this investigation, subscribe to our channel and check the pinned link for a verified tip line.
The next stretch of the inquiry moved from fragments to narrative, each small piece nudging the story closer to a single person's doorstep. The partial DNA hit that had appeared in the state database was the kind of scientific nudge detectives live for, not definitive on its own, but directional. It pointed to an extended family connection, and that narrow channel led them to a name in a neighboring county, a cousin with a simple arrest record from years earlier, nothing violent. When detectives interviewed that cousin, he remembered a woman who had, in recent months, begun speaking about missing parts of her life and about volunteering with infants. He recalled that she sometimes seemed too focused on others' newborn photos. That recollection by itself was circumstantial. What it did, however, was give detectives a place to look deeper into Marion Hale's recent patterns. Investigators widened their canvas. They subpoenaed more footage, cross-checked retail surveillance, and followed payment trails. Slowly, a composite of movement emerged. The beige coat was not a single object, but a recurring silhouette across camera feeds in the neighborhood for days preceding the attack. The same tote, or one like it, showed up in footage at the charity distribution where Marion had volunteered, and again walking away from the convenience store. Phone pings placed a device associated with Marion in the area during the critical window. Witnesses who had once described Marion as a friendly volunteer now recalled moments: an intense stare at a newborn during a donation drive, a lingering question aimed at a mother that, in retrospect, felt like fixations. 2 days after the attack, at 3:12 a.m., the city received a call from a nearby parish. An infant had been found inside a small blanket at the back entrance of St. Luke's, left on a folded towel near a collection bin. The woman who discovered the baby, a parish volunteer, wrapped the child and called 911. The child was alive, crying weakly, and was transported immediately to the pediatric emergency department. Hospital teams took over with the singular focus of keeping the newborn stable and notifying authorities. From that moment, the investigation changed tack. Locating the infant did not resolve the legal questions or the moral ones, how and why this had been done, but it did change the urgency. The first priority became establishing the child's identity and ensuring the newborn's safety. Hospital staff coordinated with child welfare officials and detectives. Biosamples were taken and, following a court order, compared to a sample obtained from Ivy in the course of her treatment. Within a day, preliminary genetic comparison confirmed what the police had feared and hoped in equal measure. The infant was biologically Ivy's.
The confirmation was solemnly worded in the press room as a forensic match, a piece of evidence that narrowed the scope of the investigation to the question of who had taken the child. There is a technical care to how such language is presented. In public briefings, the police emphasized that DNA comparison established maternity in a laboratory setting. They avoided detailing clinical procedures and noted that any specific medical interventions were in definito without access to patient records. The distinction mattered to prosecutors and defense counsel alike. For the family, it was a devastating, private validation. The child who had been missing was their child. With the infant located in protective custody and Ivy stabilized in the hospital, her physical condition described by clinicians as serious but improving, the lead detective and the district attorney's office convened to evaluate the next steps.
Gathering the infant into safety did not make the rest of the case simple. The prosecution needed to show not only that the infant was taken, but also who had taken the child and how the act occurred. Evidence had to be admissible, witnesses credible, and timelines airtight. Investigators returned to Marion's patterns. They re-interviewed co-workers at the charity distribution, this time focusing on specific dates and small interactions, a request to hold a foster infant for a photo, a question about how parents named their children, a conversation about adoption. At the hotel, surveillance footage that had once been grainy and inconclusive became more meaningful when placed beside other frames. Analysts created composite timelines showing Marion's movements: convenience store at 6:59 p.m., hotel loading dock at 7:14 p.m., a parked rideshare vehicle at 7:20 p.m. These data points were not, singly, proof. Together, they formed a pattern that prosecutors believed would be persuasive to a jury. Lab results continued to arrive. Fiber analysis showed that the weave of material on some of the recovered garments matched tags from boxes Marion had distributed at a charity drive. A pair of dots on a blouse reportedly found in Marion's laundry matched microfibers from the baby blanket left at St. Luke's. Forensics also located trace DNA on the clothing items that returned a stronger profile after additional testing. Investigators then relied on an oft-used investigative tool, triangulation. Phone metadata, witness statements, surveillance footage, and lab results were layered together until alternative explanations became less plausible. Marion was arrested on charges that included kidnapping, aggravated assault, and unlawful taking of a child. In court filings, prosecutors described the factual basis for each count: the coordinated surveillance timestamping her movements, the fiber and DNA matches, and the convenience store purchase placing her near the scene in the minutes before the fought.
Defense counsel filed motions seeking to suppress certain pieces of evidence, arguing, for example, that the phone ping data were unreliable and that the fiber matches were circumstantial. These motions would be a central battleground in pretrial hearings. A common misconception in public conversation is that arrest equals conviction. The DA's office spoke to that point repeatedly. Charges were a step in the justice system, not its conclusion. The criminal process tests evidence in adversarial settings. Judges rule on admissibility, juries weigh credibility, and counsel argue legal theories. Marion, for her part, entered pleas of not guilty. Her attorney asserted that the case was built on conjecture and that identification was uncertain. The defense raised questions about the investigative chain. Had evidence been collected in a way that preserved its integrity? Could surveillance frames be misread? Were witnesses reliable under the pressure of intense media coverage? The court calendar moved deliberately. During pretrial hearings, detectives explained their collection of evidence in methodical detail. Forensic technicians testified about chain of custody procedures. The lab chemist described how fibers were analyzed and how DNA profiles were generated, always careful to couch their testimony in probabilistic terms and to avoid overstatement. Where technical specificities touched on medical interventions performed on Ivy, the prosecution abstained from excessive detail, flagging those points as indefinitive for the record, unless medical staff were called to testify with permission from the hospital and the family. Alongside the legal maneuvering, two broader narratives developed in the public sphere. One was about Marion as an apparent contradiction: volunteer, neighbor, a photographed figure smiling with other people's infants. The other was about institutional responsibility. Did hospitals, charities, or businesses have blind spots that made this crime possible? Public forums brimmed with both empathy and anger. City council members convened panels on maternal safety. Social media oscillated between calls for restraint and calls for retribution. Experts were asked to help the public understand the psychology and mechanics behind the crime. A forensic psychologist agreed to speak on the record, carefully, with the constraints of not diagnosing someone without a formal evaluation. In broad terms, she explained how manipulative behavior sometimes uses the performance of need to create opportunities. An individual could plausibly adopt the posture of vulnerability, carrying baby clothes, asking for help, so that an emotionally available person steps in, she said. That alone doesn't explain motive. Motive remains a separate issue. Some offenders seek children for profit, some for pathological desire, some to fulfill a perceived lack. Each possibility requires separate investigation.
She labeled these as hypotheses rather than conclusions, and urged the public to refrain from reducing a complex psychological profile to a single neat narrative. Another piece of analysis came from a legal scholar who outlined what prosecutors would need to prove at trial: identity of the defendant at the scene, intent to unlawfully take the infant, and causation linking the defendant's conduct to the child's removal. The scholar explained in plain language that circumstantial evidence can be powerful when it forms a coherent picture. Convictions are often secured through layers of circumstantial facts, rather than a single explosive piece of proof. When the trial began months later, the courtroom was tense in a way that the city's residents were beginning to expect from high-profile cases.
Media pools sat behind a barrier, family members sat together in the front row. Ivy, still recovering from her physical injuries and from the psychological impact, did not attend the entire trial. At times, she left the courthouse after giving a short, measured victim impact statement that prosecutors entered into the record. Her words were careful but searing in their quietness. She spoke about the emptiness of not knowing, and the small rituals that had once filled her days, folding tiny clothes, running errands, sorting through names. She asked, simply, for the truth to come out. Prosecutors laid out their case in a steady arc. They presented the surveillance timeline, played the convenience store footage, and introduced forensic fiber comparisons. They called a forensic laboratory director who explained the statistical likelihood that the fibers and DNA profiles matched material associated with Marion and not the general population, always emphasizing that statistics are about probability, not absolute uniqueness. The prosecution called an analyst who demonstrated how the phone metadata linked a device registered to Marion's account to cell towers surrounding the hotel at the time of the attack. The pictures were granular, receipts, timestamps, and the chain of custody forms that documented every evidence transfer. The defense attacked each thread. They brought in independent fiber specialists who challenged the exclusivity of the material match. They argued that cell tower pings can reflect phones left at certain places, that devices can be borrowed, and that a registered account did not prove Marion was carrying the phone at the time. Witnesses who had placed Marion near the scene were questioned about lighting conditions and how, in the dark, coats can look similar and shoppers can look like volunteers. The defense also raised the possibility of alternative perpetrators, arguing that the evidence was not yet robust enough to single out Marion beyond reasonable doubt.
Perhaps the trial's most consequential testimony came from a hospital nurse and a forensic nurse examiner who were called to describe, clinically and without sensational detail, the nature of Ivy's injuries and the immediate medical response. They told the jury in measured terms that Ivy had suffered severe abdominal trauma consistent with a violent assault, and that emergency surgery had been necessary. They carefully avoided graphic descriptions, adhering to medical confidentiality where required. The forensic nurse explained how certain types of clinical findings can indicate forced removal of a neonate without delving into anatomical detail. The nurse framed observations procedurally and labeled any technical nuance as indefinito when it moved beyond what could be safely and ethically discussed in a public forum. On cross-examination, defense counsel focused on the lab's methodology and on potential contamination points. They questioned whether evidence handling protocols had been watertight. The prosecution responded by walking jurors through the chain of custody logs, the sealed evidence bags, and the certifications that forensic analysts held. The courtroom became an environment of minute scrutiny, as both sides sought to convert ambiguity into conviction or reasonable doubt. An emotional pivot arrived when the lead detective recounted an interview with a neighbor who had changed his testimony under pressure from online harassment. The neighbor had initially hesitated to come forward because of threats posted on neighborhood forums calling him a liar. The detective's testimony illustrated a disturbing byproduct of modern cases, the way social media can shape, intimidate, or dissuade witnesses. The judge admonished the public for online harassment and urged caution in commentary, a small judicial rebuke that made national headlines. Meanwhile, in parallel proceedings, the civil world reeled. Charities that had worked with Marion released statements emphasizing that volunteers are screened, but that no system is infallible. The Grand Meridian Hotel instituted a revised safety protocol for staff working late shifts. Employees would be advised not to leave alone during scheduled breaks, and managers would stagger break times to ensure someone was always aware when a staff member left the property. City health officials announced a review of outreach programs aimed at expectant mothers, urging community groups to ensure volunteer screening and supervision were in place. Back in the courtroom, emotional testimony from Ivy's sister and from Derek underscored the human toll. Derek, in a voice that sometimes broke, told jurors about the final text messages and the empty crib they had bought on sale for months. He spoke of returning to the apartment and finding the little sock Ivy had knitted, small details that jurors often remember long after the legal arguments fade.
The defense counselor gently suggested remembering the presumption of innocence, but the human testimony had already moved many listeners. The prosecution closed by stitching together the circumstantial threats, the convenience store purchase, the hotel loading dock footage, the fiber and DNA evidence, the phone metadata, and Marion's presence in the area. They argued that while each piece could be explained away independently, the totality of the evidence made a single explanation, the defendant's involvement, far more compelling than a mosaic of unrelated coincidences. The defense asked jurors to see holes, imperfect footage, partial DNA matches, the possibility of borrowed phones or mistaken identity. They reminded the jury that guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt, and that the state's case, while earnest, left space for alternative narratives. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on counts of kidnapping and aggravated assault. The judge's face remained impassive as he announced the decision, then set a date for sentencing. For the family, the verdict was a measure of closure on one question, but not an end to grief or the practical consequences of what had been done. A conviction would not restore lost time or erase the trauma. It would, however, mean accountability and the beginning of a legal reckoning. The sentencing drew public attention. Ivy issued, through a statement read by her counsel, a message that emphasized the need for institutional change and the painful path toward healing. Marion expressed remorse in a letter read in court, but maintained, through counsel, that aspects of the evidence were being reconsidered on appeal. She later sought psychiatric evaluation. The defense continued to argue aspects of diminished capacity. Appellate filings followed the regular patterns of the system: challenges to evidentiary rulings, arguments about the admissibility of particular lab results, and disputes about jury instructions. Outside the courthouse, the city's debates shifted toward prevention. Community leaders advocated for safer public spaces and for better support for pregnant women who may be socially isolated or economically vulnerable. A local midwifery collective proposed trainings for volunteers who work with expectant mothers in community centers: how to recognize manipulative behavior, how to keep encounters public, and how to ensure that volunteers never act alone in sensitive situations. A nonprofit that ran donation drives pledged to institute more rigorous sign-in procedures and to require identification checks for volunteers handling newborn items. Media ethics also rose to the surface as a discussion topic. Several outlets that had earlier magnified rumors issued retractions or corrections after misidentifications harmed private individuals. The mayor convened a press ethics advisory panel to discuss responsible reporting in sensitive cases, particularly those involving children.
The advisory urged media organizations to balance the public's right to know with the risk of collateral harm to uninvolved parties. For Ivy and Derek, the aftermath was a long, fractured path. Counseling, legal appointments, and the slow work of rebuilding daily life filled months. The bond they had anticipated with their child had been ruptured by violence. Rebuilding trust in the world would take additional time. They formed a small circle of support: friends from the hotel, neighbors who had left notes and flowers, and staff from local clinics who helped them navigate bureaucracy and mental health resources. The community tended their wounds in small, concrete ways: meal trains, child care assistance for Derek's other obligations, and help with hospital appointments. The infant, placed temporarily in foster care, received specialized trauma-informed care. Pediatricians and social workers coordinated procedures to ensure the child's physical well-being and, crucially, to help stabilize attachment and early developmental needs. Those working with the child emphasized the need for careful handling of public disclosures to protect the baby's future privacy. A court ultimately ruled on temporary custody measures and outlined a plan that took into account the child's safety and long-term welfare. There were policy ripples beyond that immediate circle. Hospitals reviewed their admission, transfer, and custody protocols, looking for ways to improve partner notification systems and to coordinate better with law enforcement when a patient is the victim of a violent crime. Nonprofits that organized maternal support groups strengthened volunteer oversight. City-sponsored outreach clarified that helping behavior should be encouraged, but should occur within community structures that protect both the giver and the receiver: public places, buddy systems, and transparent identification practices. One of the most sobering lessons was about the texture of public grief and the ways community conversations can veer into harmful speculation. Several individuals who had been named incorrectly in early social posts faced harassment and defamation, leading to lawsuits and to renewed calls for responsible online discourse. The police and the local press issued joint statements, urging the public to submit potential evidence to official tip lines, rather than conducting online investigations that could mislead or wound innocent people. There were also constructive outcomes. A city council ordinance allocated funds to create a small grant program for expectant mothers in precarious housing situations, coupled with a public safety campaign that emphasized the importance of community vigilance combined with professional oversight. Charitable organizations offered additional training budgets and shifted to more transparent volunteer practices. In the courtroom's wake, the legal system continued to test the balance between evidence and fairness.
Appeals processes unfolded, as they do in serious criminal cases, and the conversation about the strength of circumstantial evidence remained part of local legal education. Law schools used the case as a study in how multifaceted evidence, digital, forensic, testimonial, must be synthesized and presented to juries without overstating certainty. The case prompted debates about the admissibility of certain types of forensic comparisons and about safeguards that should apply when partial DNA matches are used to generate leads. Through all of this, the city's mood shifted slowly from shock toward a weary kind of vigilance. People returned to routine with new habits. Expectant mothers talked privately about safer ways to accept help. Volunteer programs adapted. The hotel where Ivy had worked kept a small plaque in the staff room, not of the crime, but of solidarity, and a reminder of the human consequences that policies must always seek to prevent. If there is a final reflection that threads these events, it is this. The case revealed how easily ordinary kindness can be weaponized by someone who intends harm, and how easily ordinary people can be caught in the intersection. It also revealed the strengths and limits of institutions. Detectives relied on methodical evidence collection. Hospital teams acted to save lives. Prosecutors pieced together circumstantial facts into a narrative that a jury found compelling. At the same time, the case laid bare the vulnerabilities in social systems, how volunteers are screened, how staff take breaks, how bystanders react under duress, and it prompted a communal response aimed at shoring up those weaknesses. The conviction did not erase the trauma. It did not restore the months that had been lost, or the quiet rituals extinguished by violence. But it did deliver an answer to a fundamental legal question. Who had been responsible? And could the state hold that person to account? For Ivy's family, it was not a conclusion so much as a step in the long process of survival and reconstruction. If you or someone you know is affected by sexual violence, assault, or a crime involving a child, you are not alone. For immediate help in the United States, you can contact the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673 or via online chat at rain.org. If you are in crisis and need immediate support, call 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. For those outside the U.S., local law enforcement or national hotlines and local victim support organizations can provide urgent assistance. If you have information about a crime, please contact your local police department or submit tips through verified channels. Do not engage in independent investigations or online doxing. This case forced a city to ask hard questions about trust, safety, and responsibility. It reminded neighbors to watch out for one another in ways that protect dignity, not to invade privacy.
It reminded institutions that protocols mean little without enforcement, and that empathy must be accompanied by practical safeguards. Above all, it asked the public to hold multiple truths at once: the need for justice, the need to protect victims' privacy, and the need to avoid hasty conclusions in the face of incomplete information. If you want to keep following this investigation and further reporting on reforms and court updates, subscribe and check the pinned links below for verified resources and contact information to share tips safely. Share this episode with care. The people at the center of such stories deserve dignity, not speculation.